The shocking truth about God becoming your source nobody tells you. Most people speak of God as help. Few are prepared for God as source. Help implies distance. Source implies replacement. And this is where the shock begins. When God becomes your source, something quietly but profoundly changes. You are no longer supported by the world, you are sustained by something prior to it. No one tells you that this transition often feels like loss before it feels like freedom. Because the moment you stop looking to the visible for supply, the visible seems to withdraw. Jobs feel uncertain, relationships feel unstable, plans feel suspended in midair, and the human mind panics, not because God has failed, but because the old props are being removed. We are conditioned to believe supply comes through people, paychecks, positions, and effort. Yet these are not sources, they are channels. A channel can close, a source cannot. The shocking truth is this: as long as you believe something outside of you is your source, you will be subject to fear. Fear of loss, fear of lack, fear of tomorrow. But when consciousness awakens to divine source, fear loses its foundation. This does not mean life becomes easier in the way the ego expects. It means life becomes truer. You may discover that striving exhausts you, that planning feels hollow, that ambition no longer satisfies. And this is not failure, it is initiation. Because divine supply does not respond to anxiety, manipulation, or force, it responds to alignment. When the inner resistance dissolves, when the desperate grasping stops, when the mind grows still enough to listen, supply appears often in ways that logic cannot trace, not as excess, not as indulgence, but as sufficiency that carries peace with it. Here is what no one tells you: God does not supplement your human effort. God replaces it, not by removing action but by removing strain. You still move, you still work, but the burden lifts. You are no longer trying to make life happen. You are allowing life to express itself through you. And this is the great reversal. You stop asking, "How will I survive?" and begin living from the certainty, "I am sustained." When God is your source, you do not chase opportunity, you become available to it. You do not beg for doors to open. You stand where doors naturally appear. This is not mystical escapism, it is spiritual law. The outer world rearranges itself around inner conviction. So the real question is not whether God can be your source. The question is whether you are willing to release every false one. Because when you do, you will find that what you feared losing was never holding you up in the first place. And what remains is a life upheld by something that does not fail, does not fluctuate, and does not abandon. That is the shocking truth. When God becomes your source, the first and most unsettling change is not external but internal, because dependence quietly migrates from outer systems to inner awareness. Most people are trained from childhood to believe that security flows from visible structures such as employment, savings, education, social approval, and personal effort. These systems appear solid because they are measurable, named, and socially reinforced. Yet this kind of dependence creates a fragile sense of safety, because anything that can be measured can also be lost. When spiritual awareness begins to dawn, the individual starts to sense that these outer systems have never truly been the origin of supply, only the temporary forms through which it appeared. This realization is not comforting at first, it feels destabilizing, as though the ground beneath one's feet has shifted without warning. Inner awareness does not announce itself loudly. It does not argue with logic or compete with evidence. It simply begins to loosen the emotional attachment to external guarantees. A person may still hold a job, maintain relationships, and participate in society, yet inwardly something has changed. There is a subtle recognition that life is not being held together by these things. This awareness often emerges during moments of crisis, when outer systems fail despite effort and good intentions. At such times the mind searches for something more reliable than circumstance, and in that searching awareness turns inward rather than outward. What makes this shift shocking is that inner awareness offers no immediate proof. Outer systems provide receipts, contracts, balances, and validation. Inner awareness provides only a quiet sense of rightness, a calm that does not depend on conditions. To trust this awareness feels irresponsible to the conditioned mind, which equates control with safety. The ego resists because it cannot manage or predict inner guidance in the same way it manages plans. Yet slowly, as dependence on awareness grows, fear begins to lose its grip, not because problems vanish but because identity is no longer anchored to outcomes. This transition exposes how much emotional energy was invested in maintaining external stability. People often discover that their anxiety was not caused by lack, but by the belief that they alone were responsible for producing supply. Inner awareness dissolves this burden. It reveals that life has an intelligence of its own, one that operates before thought, effort, and strategy. When attention rests there, action becomes simpler and less desperate. Decisions arise with clarity rather than pressure. Effort is still present, but it is no longer driven by panic or self-preservation. Dependence on inner awareness also reshapes relationships. When people are no longer viewed as sources of validation, support, or survival, attachment softens. Expectations lessen. Love becomes cleaner, less transactional. This does not lead to isolation, it leads to freedom. Others are no longer unconsciously tasked with fulfilling needs they were never designed to meet. In this freedom, relationships often become more honest, because they are chosen rather than required. The same shift occurs with money and work. When outer systems are seen as channels rather than origins, fear around loss decreases. A channel can change without threatening one's existence. Inner awareness holds the understanding that supply is not limited to a single form. This does not promote passivity, it removes desperation. Work becomes an expression rather than a lifeline. Creativity flows more naturally when survival is no longer the dominant motive. What few understand is that inner awareness is not imagination or positive thinking. It is a state of consciousness that perceives life as already sustained. From this state, one stops asking how to get and starts noticing what is unfolding. Attention moves from accumulation to alignment. There is a growing trust that what is needed will appear as it is needed, not always in expected forms, but always with a sense of right timing. As dependence shifts inward, silence becomes valuable. Stillness is no longer empty, it is instructive. In that stillness, awareness communicates without words, offering direction through clarity, restraint, or sudden knowing. The individual learns to wait without anxiety, to move without forcing, to rest without guilt, and to act without fear, because the source of life is no longer perceived as distant, external, or conditional but present, sustaining, and quietly sufficient in every unfolding moment. When God becomes your source, one of the most misunderstood realities is that control must be lost before true supply can be known. This is deeply unsettling because the human sense of security is built on the belief that control equals safety. From early on, people are taught to plan, manage, secure, and protect. Effort is praised, self-reliance is celebrated, and surrender is often confused with weakness. Yet the moment divine source begins to replace human management, the structures that once gave a sense of control start to loosen. This loosening is not gentle. It often feels like disorientation, vulnerability, and exposure, because the mind no longer knows how to guarantee outcomes. Loss of control does not arrive as a spiritual idea, it arrives as lived experience. Plans stop working the way they used to. Strategies that once produced results yield diminishing returns. Effort increases while peace decreases. This creates frustration and confusion, because the individual is doing everything right according to past understanding, yet life seems unresponsive. What is actually happening is that consciousness is being invited out of dependence on personal will. As long as one believes that outcomes must be managed through force, timing, or manipulation, divine supply remains theoretical rather than experiential. The ego resists this transition fiercely because it interprets loss of control as danger. It equates surrender with collapse. Yet surrender in this context is not giving up responsibility. It is relinquishing the false belief that one's limited perception can govern an infinite process. Human control operates from fear of lack, fear of failure, and fear of uncertainty. Divine supply operates from completeness. These two states cannot coexist. One must give way for the other to function. This is why the period before true supply often feels like absence. The old methods stop producing, but the new awareness has not yet stabilized. In this in-between space, the mind panics and attempts to regain control through increased effort, analysis, or worry. Ironically, this very grasping delays the recognition of supply, because divine provision does not respond to tension. It responds to receptivity. The moment effort shifts from forcing outcomes to allowing direction, something subtle changes. Life begins to move again, not chaotically, but intelligently. Loss of control also dismantles the illusion of self-sufficiency. Many people unconsciously believe they are the origin of their success, their income, their stability. When circumstances strip away this belief, humility emerges, often painfully. Yet this humility is not humiliation, it is clarity. It reveals that life has always been sustained by something beyond personal will. The shock lies in realizing that control was never real, only assumed. What felt like management was often cooperation with forces already in motion. In this process, timing becomes a major challenge. The human mind wants immediate reassurance, but divine supply unfolds with precision rather than urgency. Delays are interpreted as denial, when in fact they are alignment. What appears as stagnation is often a recalibration of consciousness. Old motivations are being purified. Actions driven by fear are losing momentum. New impulses, quieter and more grounded, begin to surface. These impulses do not shout. They require listening rather than striving. Loss of control also exposes emotional attachments. When outcomes can no longer be forced, hidden dependencies rise to the surface. Approval, recognition, security, and identity tied to achievement all demand attention. This exposure is uncomfortable yet necessary. Divine supply does not reinforce false identities. It supports truth. As attachments loosen, space is created for a different quality of action, one that flows rather than strains. What few expect is that when control is released, responsibility does not disappear, it transforms. Action becomes responsive instead of reactive. Choices are made from clarity instead of pressure. There is less mental noise and more intuitive precision. The individual still participates fully in life, but without the burden of carrying the future alone. Effort becomes lighter, not because less is done, but because resistance has diminished. The deepest shock is realizing that control was the obstacle, not the solution. The very mechanisms used to secure life were blocking awareness of a supply that required trust rather than management. When this trust stabilizes, provision no longer feels miraculous, it feels natural. Life begins to meet needs without struggle, not always in predictable ways, but always with a sense of coherence. The individual no longer braces against uncertainty, because uncertainty is no longer perceived as empty but as fertile, responsive, and alive with intelligence that does not need to be directed, only allowed. When God becomes your source, one of the most radical shifts in understanding is realizing that supply is not something you produce, earn, or manufacture, but something that is revealed through alignment. This directly challenges the deeply ingrained belief that effort is the origin of provision. From a young age, people are conditioned to equate labor with worth and productivity with survival. The idea that supply could already exist, waiting to be uncovered rather than created, sounds passive or unrealistic to the conditioned mind. Yet spiritual awareness exposes a different order at work, one in which abundance is not generated by strain but made visible through consciousness. Human effort functions within limitation. It depends on time, energy, opportunity, and physical capacity. No matter how disciplined or intelligent a person may be, effort alone always encounters ceilings. This is why even the most driven individuals experience exhaustion, anxiety, or fear beneath their achievements. They sense, often unconsciously, that they are trying to uphold life through personal force. When supply is believed to be self-produced, the individual lives under constant pressure to maintain momentum, because stopping feels like risking collapse. This pressure creates a restless mind and a defensive approach to life. The revelation that supply is revealed rather than produced dismantles this pressure. It introduces the understanding that life has an inherent completeness that is not dependent on personal struggle. This does not deny action or responsibility, it redefines their role. Action becomes a response to inner guidance rather than an attempt to secure existence. The individual begins to notice that when the mind is quiet and motives are clear, the right resources, connections, and opportunities appear without excessive effort. This appearing is not random, it follows alignment. Alignment is not moral perfection or positive thinking. It is the state in which thought, intention, and awareness are no longer fragmented by fear. When fear dominates, perception narrows, the mind fixates on lack and in doing so overlooks what is already present. Supply remains unseen not because it is absent, but because attention is distorted. As awareness settles into trust, perception widens. Needs are met through avenues that were previously ignored or dismissed. What once seemed unavailable reveals itself as accessible. This is why many people experience supply only after reaching the limits of effort. When striving fails, attention turns inward. In that turning, resistance softens. The individual becomes receptive rather than forceful. Receptivity is not waiting idly, it is openness without tension. In this openness, intuition becomes clearer. Decisions feel simpler. The compulsion to control every outcome weakens. Life begins to feel cooperative rather than adversarial. The idea of revealing supply also reframes scarcity. Scarcity is not merely the absence of resources, it is a state of consciousness that perceives separation. When one believes they are cut off from the source of life, everything must be acquired, defended and accumulated. This creates competition and fear. Alignment dissolves this sense of separation. It reveals that life is not withholding but responding. As consciousness aligns with this truth, supply flows in proportion to need, not desire driven by insecurity. Another unsettling aspect of revealed supply is that it does not always appear in expected forms. The mind often defines supply narrowly, attaching it to specific outcomes. When alignment is present, life meets needs with precision rather than preference. This can feel disappointing to the ego, which seeks validation through particular forms. Yet over time, one recognizes that what appears is exactly what sustains growth, clarity, and stability. Satisfaction deepens, not because there is excess, but because there is appropriateness. Revealed supply also removes comparison. When abundance is seen as something to be produced, people measure themselves against others, believing resources are limited. When supply is revealed, comparison loses meaning. Each life unfolds according to its own alignment. What appears for one is not taken from another. This understanding fosters ease rather than competition, generosity rather than hoarding. Perhaps the most difficult part of this truth is trust. Trusting revealed supply requires releasing the belief that anxiety improves outcomes. Many people cling to worry as a form of vigilance, believing it proves responsibility. Alignment shows that worry clouds perception. When the mind is agitated, it cannot recognize what is already present. Stillness sharpens awareness. From that stillness, right action emerges naturally. As this understanding deepens, effort does not disappear, but it changes quality. Work becomes purposeful instead of compulsive. Rest no longer carries guilt. Waiting no longer feels like stagnation. Life is experienced as unfolding rather than being forced. The individual learns that supply is not summoned through struggle but uncovered through awareness, and that what sustains life has always been present, patiently awaiting recognition. When the understanding dawns that human effort has a ceiling while spiritual law does not, a profound recalibration takes place in how life is approached. Human effort is valuable, disciplined, and often necessary, but it is inherently finite. It is bound by time, energy, circumstance, knowledge, and physical capacity. No matter how determined a person may be, effort alone cannot transcend these limits. There are only so many hours in a day, only so much strength in the body, only so much clarity in the mind. This is not a flaw, it is simply the nature of human functioning. The problem arises when effort is mistaken for the ultimate power sustaining life. When people rely exclusively on effort, they live under constant pressure to outperform limitation. This creates a subtle exhaustion that accumulates over time. Even success carries tension because it must be maintained. The fear beneath effort is the belief that if one stops pushing, everything will collapse. This belief keeps the nervous system in a state of vigilance and the mind in perpetual calculation. Spiritual law operates in a completely different dimension. It is not bound by time, does not fatigue, and does not require maintenance. It is not something that fluctuates based on performance or mood. It functions consistently, impersonally, and without depletion. The ceiling of human effort becomes most visible when effort increases but results do not. Many people experience periods where they work harder, plan more carefully, and sacrifice more, yet outcomes stagnate or even deteriorate. This creates confusion and often self-blame. The individual assumes they are not doing enough, not being disciplined enough, or not being smart enough. What is actually being revealed is the limitation of effort when it is asked to do what it was never designed to do: sustain life independently. Spiritual law does not negate effort, it places it in its proper role. Spiritual law functions as the underlying intelligence of life. It governs growth, order, timing, and provision without strain. A seed does not struggle to become a tree, it responds to a law already in motion. When consciousness aligns with this law, effort becomes cooperative rather than compensatory. Action flows from insight instead of fear. The same tasks may be performed, but they are carried by a sense of support rather than urgency. This is why people sometimes accomplish more with less effort when they are inwardly aligned than they ever did through force. One of the hardest adjustments is releasing the belief that effort earns supply. Spiritual law does not reward strain nor does it punish rest. It responds to alignment, clarity, and receptivity. This can feel deeply unfair to a mind trained in merit-based systems. Yet life itself demonstrates this truth constantly. The sun does not shine more brightly for those who worry more. The heart does not beat more reliably because it is supervised. These functions operate under law, not effort. When supply is placed under the same understanding, anxiety begins to lose its justification. Human effort is reactive, spiritual law is proactive. Effort responds to problems after they appear. Law anticipates need before it is consciously recognized. This is why solutions sometimes arrive unexpectedly, even before a request is fully formed. The mind interprets this as coincidence, but alignment recognizes it as order. When reliance shifts towards spiritual law, the individual becomes more attentive and less forceful. Listening replaces pushing. Timing becomes intuitive rather than scheduled by fear. Another limitation of effort is that it often reinforces identity. People define themselves by what they do, produce, or achieve. When effort reaches its ceiling, identity feels threatened. Spiritual law dissolves this fragility by shifting identity from performance to being. Worth is no longer measured by output. This does not lead to laziness, it leads to authenticity. Action becomes an expression of inner clarity rather than a defense against inadequacy. Spiritual law also operates without competition. Effort often assumes scarcity, creating comparison and rivalry. Law assumes sufficiency, allowing each life to unfold according to its own design. When this is understood, envy softens and cooperation increases. There is less need to prove, dominate, or rush. Progress feels natural rather than pressured. What surprises many is that aligning with spiritual law often requires less visible effort but greater inner honesty. Motives must be examined. Fear-driven goals lose momentum. This can feel like regression, but it is actually refinement. The law does not support what is misaligned even if effort is intense. When intention becomes clear and fear loosens, momentum returns, often effortlessly. Human effort reaches its ceiling quickly when asked to create peace, security, or meaning. Spiritual law operates endlessly in these dimensions. As reliance shifts, effort becomes a tool rather than a burden, and life begins to feel sustained by something larger than personal capacity. something that does not tire, does not falter, and does not require constant management to remain active and effective. When faith matures into a state of consciousness rather than remaining a belief, everything about how life is experienced begins to change. Belief is often fragile because it depends on reinforcement. It needs evidence, reassurance, and repetition. When circumstances challenge belief, doubt easily enters and fear quickly follows. This is because belief usually exists in the mind as an idea one tries to hold on to. Consciousness, on the other hand, is not something one holds, it is something one lives from. When faith becomes consciousness, it no longer requires constant affirmation, because it functions as the lens through which reality is perceived. Most people begin with belief because belief is accessible. It is taught, inherited, or adopted through influence. Belief can inspire, comfort, and motivate, but it does not necessarily transform perception. A person can believe in divine support and still feel abandoned when challenges arise. This inner conflict reveals the limitation of belief alone. Faith as consciousness eliminates this conflict by dissolving the separation between what one thinks and what one experiences. Trust is no longer an effort, it becomes the natural response to life. This shift occurs gradually and often through experience rather than intention. Repeated moments of being carried through difficulty soften the need to mentally convince oneself of support. Over time, the individual notices that life continues to unfold even when understanding is absent. Needs are met in unexpected ways. Solutions emerge without force. These experiences accumulate quietly until trust stabilizes beneath thought. At that point, faith no longer fluctuates with circumstances. It remains present in uncertainty, loss, and delay. When faith is consciousness, the nervous system relaxes. There is less internal resistance to what is happening. This does not mean passivity or indifference, it means acceptance without fear. The mind stops interpreting every challenge as a threat. Instead, challenges are seen as movements within a larger order. This perception changes how decisions are made. Choices arise from clarity rather than urgency. Action is taken without panic because outcomes are no longer viewed as the sole determinants of security. Faith as consciousness also alters the experience of time. Belief is impatient, it wants proof now. Conscious trust is patient without effort. Waiting no longer feels like punishment or neglect, it feels like part of an unfolding process. This patience is not resignation, it is confidence without tension. The individual is no longer racing against imagined deadlines imposed by fear. Timing is sensed rather than forced. One of the most striking changes is the absence of inner debate. When faith remains a belief, the mind constantly argues with itself, weighing possibilities, rehearsing fears, and preparing for disappointment. When faith becomes consciousness, this mental noise diminishes. There is a settled quality within, a quiet knowing that does not need explanation. This knowing cannot always be articulated, but it is deeply felt. It guides action subtly, often through restraint as much as through movement. Another significant shift is the way responsibility is experienced. Belief often places responsibility entirely on the individual, with faith serving as emotional backup. Conscious faith redistributes responsibility. The individual still acts, plans, and works, but without the sense of carrying life alone. There is an awareness of cooperation rather than independence. Effort is offered, not strained. This cooperation reduces burnout and increases resilience, because failure is no longer interpreted as personal inadequacy. Faith as consciousness also dissolves performative spirituality. There is less need to appear faithful, positive, or certain. Authenticity replaces appearance. Doubts may still arise, but they do not dominate. Emotions are allowed without being judged as failures of faith. This honesty strengthens trust rather than weakening it, because trust is no longer conditional on emotional perfection. Relationships are affected as well. When faith is belief-based, people often seek reassurance from others. When faith becomes consciousness, reassurance is internal. This reduces dependency and projection. Others are no longer unconsciously asked to provide security or certainty. This creates healthier, more balanced connections, grounded in choice rather than need. Perhaps the most transformative aspect of faith as consciousness is its stability. Beliefs can be shaken, but consciousness remains. It does not argue with fear, it simply does not obey it. In moments where the mind cannot see a way forward, this inner trust remains intact. Life is not viewed as something to survive, but something to participate in. There is a sense of being held even when the path is unclear. As this state deepens, gratitude arises naturally, not as a practice but as a perception. Life is seen as responsive rather than hostile. Even difficulty carries meaning, not as punishment or test, but as movement. Faith no longer asks for guarantees because it has become the atmosphere in which living takes place, steady, quiet, and present regardless of conditions or outcomes. When God becomes your source, life often begins to rearrange itself in ways that feel unexpected, uncomfortable, and even unsettling, because the shift does not simply add something new to your life, it replaces the foundation upon which much of your life was built. Many people imagine spiritual alignment as an upgrade that enhances existing goals, relationships, and ambitions, but in reality, it functions more like a reordering. What no one prepares you for is that what no longer aligns with true dependence on divine source quietly loses its hold. This can feel like loss, confusion, or disruption before it feels like clarity. At first, the changes may seem external. Certain opportunities dry up. Relationships that once felt essential begin to feel strained or hollow. Ambitions that once motivated you lose their urgency. The mind interprets this as regression or failure because it measures progress by continuity. Yet something deeper is happening. When God becomes the source, anything that required fear, manipulation, or excessive control to sustain cannot remain stable. These structures were not wrong, they were provisional. They served a stage of consciousness that is now giving way to another. The discomfort arises because identity is often entangled with these outer arrangements. People define themselves by roles, achievements, associations, and future plans. When these begin to dissolve or shift, it can feel as though the self is being dismantled. There is a temptation to cling, to revive what is fading, to force continuity where life is clearly withdrawing energy. This resistance intensifies the discomfort. The deeper invitation is to allow the rearrangement without rushing to replace what is leaving. This phase often brings a sense of emptiness. The familiar sources of validation and motivation no longer satisfy, yet the new orientation has not fully stabilized. The mind labels this emptiness as lack, but it is actually space. Space is necessary for a higher order to establish itself. Divine source does not simply sit on top of old structures, it reorganizes them according to a different logic, one not driven by fear or self-preservation. This reorganization can feel slow because it is thorough. What makes this especially challenging is that the changes do not always appear spiritual on the surface. They may look like ordinary setbacks, misunderstandings, or delays. Friends may not understand why certain things no longer matter to you. You may not fully understand it yourself. There is often a period where you feel out of sync with your previous life but not yet at home in the new orientation. This in-between state tests trust more than any external crisis. As the rearrangement continues, priorities shift naturally. You may find yourself less willing to compromise inner peace for external gain. Decisions that once felt obvious now feel heavy or wrong. Conversely, choices that once seemed impractical feel quietly right. This is not indecision, it is sensitivity. Consciousness is learning to respond to a deeper current rather than social conditioning or fear-based logic. Relationships are especially affected. When God becomes the source, people are no longer unconsciously used as providers of security, meaning, or identity. This can create distance where dependency once existed. Some connections fall away not because of conflict, but because the unspoken contract has expired. This can feel lonely, yet it creates space for relationships grounded in authenticity rather than need. Those that remain often deepen, becoming simpler and more honest. Ambition also undergoes transformation. Goals driven by comparison, proving, or escape lose their appeal. This can feel like a loss of motivation, but it is actually a purification of motive. What emerges is not passivity but intention aligned with truth rather than fear. Action becomes more selective, less frantic. You do fewer things, but with greater clarity. Eventually the discomfort softens as the new order stabilizes. Life begins to feel coherent again, though often simpler than before. The need to constantly secure the future diminishes. Trust is no longer theoretical, it is lived. You recognize that what was removed was not punishment but preparation. The rearrangement was not chaos, but intelligence at work. What remains is a life that no longer depends on constant reinforcement from the outer world. There is a quiet confidence, not in circumstances but in source. The shock lies in realizing that the discomfort was not a sign of loss, but evidence of alignment taking root, reshaping life from the inside out according to a higher order that does not ask for comfort first, but delivers coherence, stability, and sufficiency once resistance gives way. When God becomes your source, the most unexpected and least discussed reality is that life does not simply improve, it rearranges itself, and this rearrangement is often uncomfortable at first. Many expect spiritual reliance to bring immediate ease, clarity, and visible blessing, but the initial experience is frequently the opposite. Structures that once felt stable begin to shift, certainties dissolve, familiar rhythms are interrupted. This happens not because something has gone wrong, but because the foundation of dependence is changing, and anything built on the old foundation must adjust or fall away. The discomfort arises because life has been organized around false centers of supply for a long time. Roles, habits, relationships, ambitions, and even identities have been constructed to secure safety, validation, or control. When divine source begins to take precedence, these structures are exposed. Some cannot be carried forward because they depend on fear, pressure, or compromise to survive. What is shocking is not that they change, but that they cannot coexist with a deeper reliance on God as source. This rearrangement often feels personal, as though life itself is opposing you. Plans unravel at inconvenient times. Paths you assumed were permanent suddenly close. Opportunities you worked hard to secure no longer bring peace. The mind interprets this as loss or punishment, because it measures progress by continuity and accumulation. Yet spiritual reordering operates by alignment, not accumulation. What no longer aligns with trust in source loses momentum, not through dramatic collapse but through quiet withdrawal of energy. One of the most difficult aspects of this phase is uncertainty. Old reference points are gone, and new ones are not yet fully visible. You may feel suspended between what was and what is emerging. This in-between space is deeply uncomfortable for the ego, which seeks clarity, timelines, and guarantees. Yet this space is essential. It is where attachment loosens. It is where false urgency dissolves. It is where deeper listening becomes possible. Relationships are often the first area where rearrangement is felt. When God becomes the source, people are no longer unconsciously relied upon for identity, approval, or security. This changes the dynamic, sometimes without words. Connections that were sustained by need may feel strained or distant. This can bring grief, confusion, and loneliness. Yet what is dissolving is not love but dependency. What remains or later emerges is connection rooted in choice and authenticity rather than survival. Work and ambition also undergo reordering. Goals driven by fear of lack, comparison, or the need to prove oneself begin to lose their grip. Motivation may wane, not because purpose is lost, but because false purpose is being stripped away. This can feel alarming, especially in a culture that equates worth with productivity. Yet this pause is not stagnation, it is recalibration. New direction cannot emerge while old compulsions dominate. Emotionally, this period can feel raw. Without the usual distractions and reinforcements, unprocessed fears and doubts surface. The temptation is to rush back into old patterns to regain a sense of control. This resistance intensifies the discomfort. The invitation is not to fix the discomfort, but to stay present with it. In doing so, awareness deepens. Trust moves from concept to experience. What makes this rearrangement particularly challenging is that it rarely comes with external validation. Others may not understand your choices or your stillness. You may appear to be stepping back, slowing down, or letting go of things society values. This can trigger self-doubt. Yet inner clarity often grows precisely when outer approval diminishes. The dependence on source strengthens as reliance on opinion weakens. Gradually, a new order begins to form. It is quieter, simpler, and less driven by urgency. Life starts to feel coherent again, though not necessarily easier by old standards. There is less striving and more responsiveness. Decisions are made with less internal conflict. What once felt like loss is recognized as release. What once felt like delay is understood as timing. The most surprising realization is that the discomfort was not a sign of misalignment but evidence of it. The rearrangement was not destruction but refinement. Life was not being taken away, it was being reorganized around a source that does not fluctuate, demand, or withdraw. As this understanding settles, peace emerges without fanfare. Confidence arises without bravado. There is a sense of being upheld rather than propped up, guided rather than driven, sustained rather than strained, living from a center that no longer requires constant reinforcement from the outer world, but quietly shapes it from within as trust deepens and resistance continues to fall away. In the end, the journey of God becoming your source is not about acquiring something new, but about unlearning what you were never meant to carry. It is a gradual awakening from dependence on fragile systems into trust in an intelligence that has always been sustaining life beneath the surface. What begins as discomfort reveals itself as liberation. What feels like loss becomes clarity. What appears as delay unfolds as precision. As control loosens, peace takes its place. As effort reaches its limit, a higher order is recognized. Faith matures from belief into lived awareness, and life rearranges itself around a source that does not fail, fluctuate, or withdraw. This truth is rarely spoken because it cannot be fully explained, only experienced. It asks for courage, patience, and honesty, not perfection. It invites surrender without passivity and action without strain. When God is no longer an emergency resource but the foundation itself, life is no longer something to conquer or fear, but something to participate in with trust. What remains is not certainty about outcomes, but certainty of being sustained, guided, and held even when the path is unclear. This is the quiet power of living from source, where stability no longer depends on circumstances, and peace becomes the natural state rather than the reward at the end of struggle.